Backlash from China after Taiwan's president gives a candid interview expressing faith in US support. The world's richest nations are gathering in Rome. Will climate change likely overshadow discussions? One of Taiwan's volcanoes wakes up. We find out what is making this mountain spew smoke. And Facebook's facelift. After weeks of controversy, the social media giant rebrands with a new name. A warm welcome to TaiwanPlus News. I'm Yin Khvat. China has issued a stern warning in reaction to an interview given by Taiwan's president to an international news outlet. In the CNN report, she confirmed the presence of US troops on the island. Speaking exclusively with CNN, she also said she had faith the US would come to Taiwan's defense if China were to make a move.
搞台独是死路一条，支持台独也是一条不归路。任何国家、任何人都不应低估中国人民捍卫国家主权和领土完整的坚强决心、坚定意志、强大能力，否则必将再次遭到失败。我们坚决反对美方同台湾地区进行任何形式的官方往来和军事联系，反对美方干涉中国内政。
Meanwhile, Taiwan's defense minister brought clarity to Tsai's remarks. Minister Cho Kuo-zhang told reporters that the nation must rely on itself for defense and cannot completely depend on help from others. He confirmed that US troops were not a permanent presence.
大家都有交流，做一个短期的，训完以后就会回去，绝对不是部队进驻。
Now, the United States has long used a policy it calls strategic ambiguity towards Taiwan, an approach aimed at preventing escalating tensions with China. Earlier, I spoke with Wen Song, a political scientist at the Australian National University, to find out more on how this policy works.
For those who do international relations, we know the end is what we call dual deterrence. Dual deterrence means by keeping it ambiguous whether U.S. will intervene in a Taiwan Strait crisis, U.S. can, one, deter Beijing from launching an invasion of Taiwan, because it may worry that U.S. will intervene in that scenario. But it can also, two, deter Taiwan from perhaps pursuing international space at too fast a pace, at a pace that's not comfortable to other friends and partners. It's the growth of Chinese power that's leading to increasingly imbalanced or asymmetrical dual deterrence. That is to say, as China's military power grows, U.S. ability to deter it weakens. So in order to make up for it, in order to keep that dual deterrence continue to be effective on both sides, U.S. then need to increase its own deterrence against Beijing. And that may come in the form of increasing security support for Taiwan side.
Some people are saying that it was a Freudian slip by Biden.
There is increasingly a pattern now. You see Tony Blinken saying something similar a little while ago. You see Biden, of course, talking about commitment to Taiwan. You also hear people like, I think, Linda Grenfeld a few months ago. She's the U.S. ambassador to the UN, who said something to the effect of U.S. sees Taiwan as a state. So these are things that they may or may not be slip of tongues. They may or may not be Freudian slips. But what they do tell you is that in terms of internal deliberation on the U.S. policymaking circles, I think the grounds may have changed. It seems like it's increasingly a consensus, almost taken for granted by this point, that they see Taiwan as a very important friend and ally that they want to help out whenever the cost is manageable for them to do so. So that broader attitude shift, rather than any specific verbal statements, I think it's much more dependable a guide.
The world's 20 largest economies are meeting in Rome this weekend. It is now confirmed that China's leader Xi Jinping will attend the Group of 20 summit via video link. Xi hasn't left China since 2020 because of the pandemic. COVID-19 is set to dominate the agenda, but as James Chater reports, the climate crisis is also likely to overshadow discussions.
World leaders are arriving in Rome for the first in-person G20 summit since 2019. For many heads of state, it will be the first face-to-face meeting since before the pandemic began. But missing from the reunion will be two key players, Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping, who will not be travelling to Rome for the summit. Leading the world out of the coronavirus quagmire is top of the group's agenda, which accounts for 80% of global GDP and 60% of the world's population. At a Thursday meeting of the World Health Organization in Geneva, officials said the wealth of the G20 meant it was up to them to address global vaccine inequality.
Together, these countries have the ability to make the political and financial commitments that are needed to end this pandemic and to prevent future crises.
And leaders will be contending with one of the biggest future crises, climate change, with this year's summit taking place on the eve of COP26.
For example, the G7 announced commitment to end overseas financing of coal, and our goal is to achieve a G20 agreement on that, which would be quite significant.
Ahead of the summit, the US has also said it wants to discuss Iran's nuclear capacity. But with yawning global vaccine inequality and climate finance commitments to make at COP26, leaders of the world's wealthiest economies may feel they already have enough on their plate. Chris Marr and James Chater for TaiwanPlus.
Taiwan's executive yuan, or cabinet, has approved a 4% pay rise for public sector workers from next year. The rise would be the largest pay increase for public sector workers, including civil servants, teachers and soldiers, in 25 years. The proposed amendment to next year's government budget still needs to be approved by the legislature. Our reporter Louise Watt spoke to Roy Nung, a Taipei-based fair wage advocate, and started by asking him whether the 4% rise is enough.
If you look at the wage increases over the last few years, it has therefore been inadequate, and there has been inconsistent measures to increase the manpower budget for civil servants. And the 4% increase in such context is actually urgent because civil servant salaries shouldn't be stagnant, even if it could be high, because it needs to catch up with the cost of living expenses that increases on an annual basis.
This proposal has been approved by the executive yuan, but it still has to be approved by the legislative yuan. What are the chances of that happening?
I think it is possibly just a formality. If you look at the minimum wage increase for the private sector workers, the minimum wage review committee has decided to increase minimum wage to $25,000, $25,250 next year, and it has been approved, and it has generally been approved over the last few years. Perhaps the only issue that might occur at the legislative yuan could be disagreements from the opposition, but the DPP currently has a majority, so it shouldn't be an issue.
Have they actually approved the proposal for a 4% pay rise for public sector workers, or is it a 4% rise in the manpower budget? And if so, might that not filter down to workers?
It can be a bit confusing when the media reports about this, because it says that it's a 4% increase to civil servant salaries, but then it is actually an increase to the civil servant manpower budget, and you have to take into account the number of civil servants that they employ, the number of civil servants that increases on an annual basis. And over the last few years, there have been slight increases to the amount of manpower. So even if this budget is increased, it has to be divided across the number of workers.
Experts have detected increased activity at a volcanic island that had been dormant until earlier this year. There are concerns it may be related to an earthquake that shook eastern Taiwan last weekend. Our reporter Ken Ning finds out more.
Large amounts of milky white sulfur smoke appear on the surface of a sea that seems to be boiling. This is Guishan Island off Taiwan's northeast coast, also known as Turtle Island because of its shape. The uninhabited island is also one of the country's few active volcanoes. A whale-watching boat happened to be passing as the eruption occurred, giving a rare sight to the tourists on board. While impressive, a researcher at the Taiwan Volcano Observatory, Datun, says the activity is really not so unusual.
事实上呢，那个宜兰龟山岛龟首那边呢，它在很早以前，就很久以前，它就有喷烟。那后来是因为山崩把它的那个龟首的那个地方掩盖之后，那个喷烟就消失了。
Experts say recent volcanic activity is related to the October 24th earthquake in northeast Taiwan, which was one of the strongest in 50 years.
应该说这一次龟山岛它的这个喷烟柱变大的这个事件呢，是因为最近频繁的这个地震，或者是比较大的这个地震呢，把它原先我们说被土石覆盖的这一些喷烟呢，把它的土石移除掉了，所以它才会变得更加的旺盛。那所以它这次的事件跟未来有没有可能引发更大的地震呢？其实是目前看来是没有相关联。
The island volcano had been dormant for 17 years until a minor eruption in March that was smaller than the latest one. Luckily, the volcanic activity does not pose a danger to anyone, but it has added to the intensity of the island's so-called Milk Sea, the result of underwater hot springs mixing with seawater. Asnaya Zhou and Ken Ning for TaiwanPlus.
Taiwan's government announced Thursday a loosening of pandemic restrictions after the country reached the goal of having 70% of its population receive at least one dose of a COVID-19 vaccine. From November 2nd, a mask mandate that has been in effect since May will be further relaxed to allow gym goers to exercise mask-free, while limits on crowd sizes will be lifted. Travellers can also look forward to eating again on buses, trains and domestic flights. But the government is maintaining the strict border control measures, saying that 60% of the population must be fully vaccinated before the country will reopen to visitors. Fully vaccinated travellers from more than 135 countries will be able to enter the United Kingdom without quarantine starting next week. The country's transport minister also said that 30 more countries would be added to the UK's list of nations with recognised COVID vaccines. Travellers who are not fully vaccinated will still have to take a test and undergo quarantine. Coming up after the break, meet the Indigenous drag queens who are winning hearts and minds, one fabulous performance at a time. Stay with us.
Today, 台湾人要了解的是，我们跟这片土地关系里面，它是跟你的生命的根源息息相关。像这个红块、扁柏等等，他们都是台湾的神明。长期以来，我一直误以为我在抢救山林，直到最近10年来，我才了解，我从来没有抢救山林，而是山林从来在抢救我们。我们的地球46亿年来，我们就是它的一部分，它就是我们共同的灵魂，流传在我的血液中，也流动在树叶当中。
Welcome back. You're watching TaiwanPlus News. A reminder of our top story. China has issued a stern warning following an interview with Taiwan's President Tsai, in which she confirmed the presence of US troops on the island. Now, as the United States and China continue to vie for influence in the region, it's put Taiwan in the spotlight. Usually featuring in news headlines, it's also become a topic in a popular comedic talk show. American late-night sensation John Oliver made a splash this week with his deep dive on Taiwan. The Last Week Tonight host gave a primer saying that it was weird and farcical not to acknowledge the island as a country. The 22-minute special covered everything from China's incursions into Taiwan's air defense zone and mascots to messy brawling in the national legislature.
Taiwan is 23 million people who, in the face of considerable odds, have built a free, democratic society and very much deserve the right to decide their own future in any way that they deem fit.
Our reporter Ryan Ho-Kilpatrick spoke with New Bloom founding editor Brian Hugh, who was one of the experts consulted by the show's producers. He asked what John Oliver got right about Taiwan.
So what I really liked about the segment was that it depicted Taiwan warts and all in some sense, that there's some hilarity to it. There's not idealizing Taiwan in grandiose terms, but showing some of its flaws. But, you know, as a democracy, every democracy has its flaws. For example, fighting in the legislature or the mascots that are piled in the basement of the Taipei City Hall. And so I think that really humanizes Taiwan, because I think for so long, Taiwan is either just thought of as this ideal counterpart to China, in which you idealize what was then particularly an authoritarian government under Chiang Kai-shek for decades, or you just kind of look at it in this kind of as this provocateur of cross-strait relations. And so I think that was quite strong. And I think that centering Taiwanese voices was also something that it did really well, because of the fact that recently you would have a program like Democracy Now! Having a panel discussion about Taiwan and not inviting any Taiwanese people or even considering just Taiwanese voices. And so Oliver did really drive that point home, that Taiwanese voices are the ones that matter in Taiwan's fate.
And what do you think or hope the impact of this piece will be on viewers, particularly in the United States?
So I hope that this can have an impact on demographics that are not usually reached by the usual kind of news outlets. For example, younger people, liberals particularly, and putting a frame on Taiwan that is quite sympathetic to this audience, because I think a lot of what I see from younger people on the left is just viewing Taiwan as this another thing that the Republicans or the right wing or just the Biden administration is trying to kind of ramp up in terms of U.S.-China tensions, using this as a flashpoint, using this argument to defending Taiwan just really to try to stick it to China. And so actually, I think addressing this audience, it is quite useful. And I think a lot of what I've seen from even kind of further left publications, I mean, I mentioned Democracy Now! Just now, that was not too heartening. And so I think that's what I think is good about it. And I think also just having a less serious take on things, because, you know, oftentimes this talk of just cross-strait strengthens, of Beijing's reactions, etc., it just seems like the situation is so serious, but that forgets the realities of life on the ground in Taiwan, in which people are just going about their everyday lives, and in which the perspectives of Taiwanese people are not always preoccupied with this cross-strait issues.
Japan will head to the polls on Sunday to decide its next government. The Liberal Democratic Party is expected to win yet another term in office, continuing an almost unbroken run since the 1950s. And as James Chater reports, it's raised the question whether anybody else stands a chance.
Japan is heading to the polls again, but only one party is considered a serious contender. The Liberal Democratic Party, or the LDP, has governed the country for all but 4 years since 1955. Its leader, the new Prime Minister Fumio Kishida, called a snap election last month after winning his party's leadership contest. But what's behind his party's decades-long stranglehold on power? Japan watchers agree on a combination of factors, with the party's ideological agility and disciplined factions all playing a part.
Part of it is that that the political system is generally not that polarized, with maybe some periods, some exceptional periods. And so you do have this idea of the LDP as a natural party of government, and the opposition having to work extra hard to prove that it can be trusted with power.
There are signs, however, that Japanese voters might be starting to look elsewhere. A recent by-election viewed as a litmus test for the upcoming national vote saw the LDP lose out to opposition parties. It demonstrated Kishida's promises of a new capitalism and fairer wealth distribution are unable to hide the realities of a COVID-battered economy.
If people's turnout is higher than 60%, there's the possibility for the opposition to take a majority. However, if a turnout is lower as 50%, probably LDP would stay with a coalition partner, Komeito.
The notoriously low turnouts may also prove a challenge. Just 30% of 20-year-olds voted in Japan's last election in 2017. In that poll, average turnout across the board was just over 50%, the second lowest since the Second World War. Ahead of this year's vote, Japanese celebrities have banded together to encourage young people to vote.
そんなに少ないんだみたいなことは驚いたし、その中の一人でもあるよな俺みたいな。
その世代が軽んじられるってことだから政治をウォッチしてるよっていうことを、
無関心っていう気持ちをまず一歩踏み出して行動にする、自分にも責任があるんだっていう気持ちを持って足を踏み出すことがすごく大切なんではないのかなってすごく思ったの。
But even with a high turnout, the current mathematics of Japan's parliament works against the opposition parties. The LDP currently holds 276 of 465 seats, leading many to predict a reduced majority for the LDP at most.
The LDP plus its coalition partner Komeito would need to lose something like 70 or so seats to really worry about losing its majority. I don't think we're going to come anywhere close to that. I think they might lose something like 40. I mean, that seems very much in play and will impact their ability to control the legislative process, but they're still going to be in power.
After so long in power, many within the LDP are unlikely to be satisfied with a much reduced majority. And despite only just taking over leadership of the party, a bad result could see Kishida's nascent premiership end before it's even begun. Bill Kong and James Chater for TaiwanPlus.
Following a string of controversies, Facebook is rebranding. CEO Mark Zuckerberg announced on Thursday that the company he built will now be known as Meta. It refers to the platform's focus on the metaverse, referring to a future vision of the internet comprising shared virtual spaces.
The metaverse, as I understand his vision, is it's probably a mix between the Star Trek holodeck, a 3D world where you can live and act, and if you're in a meeting, you can sit next to somebody and he or she appears real, and the Matrix. It's living in, it's taking this two-dimensional Zoom world we're in now for most people, and totally immersing you in it. And so, conceptually, you can understand it. What exactly it will be and why it will be relevant and why it will be a huge business is yet to be clarified and determined.
Taiwan's annual Pride Parade, usually the largest in Asia, will take place online this year. But the push for greater visibility and LGBT rights is about more than just one event. Drag queens from Taiwan's Indigenous community are fighting discrimination all year round, one wig at a time. Rick Glowett has this report.
Saturday night at Taipei's Red House, the heart of the city's LGBT community, and drag queen Villian is getting ready for a performance. Villian is ethnic Bunun and one of a handful of drag queens in Taipei that are battling the double stigma of being both Indigenous and LGBT. Indigenous Taiwanese make up just over 2% of the population and for decades have been treated as second-class citizens in their own country. Indigenous communities are often more traditional and conservative than mainstream society. That makes it even harder for LGBT Indigenous to come out and live as their true selves.
那时候我们家最大的现在是大舅，就是大舅舅，然后他很高龄了这样子，都在教会工作啊什么的，所以我第一次给他看的时候，他就说一个我觉得很好笑，但是他是有一点开玩笑，但是又有一点不太理解这样子。对我讲，他说你这个是妖女，他是开玩笑的感觉，但是他是看得出来他是有一点不太开心的，对不对？
Taiwan in 2019 made history by becoming the first country in Asia to legalize same-sex marriage. Taipei holds the region's largest LGBT pride event, and the country is often described as a beacon of liberalism in Asia.
我觉得变了蛮多的，说实在话，就是尤其这2年，我们这些皇后的粉丝都变得异性恋变很多，就是比例已经有点快超过那个同性恋的比例。
But traditional attitudes take time to change. These drag queens say their performance helped dismantle some of the double stigma they face. Ethnic Paiwan Draggy Boo Boo's father is a retired priest who does not accept homosexuality.
我觉得有很多跟我一样的人，对，所以我觉得，而且搞不好他们的生活、他们的处境又比我更加困难。我很幸运的事情是，至少我们家里面我有妈妈跟我弟弟，能够了解我在做什么，而且非常支持我在做什么。对我来说，这已经是非常大的解脱了。
As well as sexy performances in the gay bars of Taipei, Draggy Boo Boo gives talks to students at universities to increase LGBT visibility.
的确，这个变装皇后这样子的表演方式，其实对我来说是非常适合的，能够同时把我所想说的话，同时把我的认同，同时把我身上的特质，那些会被人家所排除的特质，我都能够一起放到我的身上，然后我很能够完全的以一个舒服自在、我很快乐的样子去进行表演。
Taiwan is often heralded as the most LGBT-friendly place in Asia, though it still has a way to go to achieve true equality. But it is brave queens like these, wielding their makeup and fake eyelashes as their armor, that are making the country a more diverse and accepting place. Alex Chen and Rick Lowett for TaiwanPlus.
Thank you for watching TaiwanPlus News. I'm Yin Khvat. We leave you with some images of New Munch Museum in Oslo, Norway. Check out the TaiwanPlus News app, YouTube and website for this show and more. Stay safe and see you next time.